By the fall of 1945, Pearl Harbor was no longer a place of shock and destruction. Instead, it had become a quiet symbol of victory. The harbor was filled with long lines of gray submarines resting calmly at their moorings. On their conning towers were painted marks showing enemy ships sunk, warships destroyed, and missions successfully completed. These submarines had crushed Japan's sea supply routes, sent millions of tons of shipping to the ocean floor, and helped turn the Pacific into waters dominated by the United States. But now, the war was over. The boats sat unused, their crews sent home, and their future unclear. The same scene appeared at submarine bases across the country. At May Island, Portsmouth, and Philadelphia, massive submarine pens built for non-stop wartime activities suddenly had no clear role. The U.S. Navy now controlled the largest and most advanced submarine fleet in the world. More than 200 submarines, many of them almost brand new, had become strategically outdated the moment Japan signed its surrender. Naval planners faced a difficult question: what should be done with a fleet designed entirely for a war that no longer existed? By September 1945, the scale of the problem was impossible to ignore. During the war, the Navy had commissioned over 200 modern fleet submarines, along with dozens of older boats dating back to the previous World War. Submarine production had reached factory-like efficiency. Shipyards such as Electric Boat in Groton, Mare Island in California, Portsmouth in New Hampshire, and Manitowoc in Wisconsin produced submarines at an unprecedented pace. The Gato, Balao, and Tench classes became some of the most successful submarine designs ever built. Yet success in war did not guarantee usefulness in peace. These submarines demanded constant maintenance, consumed valuable resources, and required large crews, often around 75 men, for long Pacific patrols. In a new world shaped by nuclear weapons and rival superpowers, many of these boats seemed poorly suited for the future. Still, hidden within this massive surplus were technologies and capabilities that would soon become vital in the Cold War. The challenge was deciding which submarines should be preserved, which could serve as experimental platforms, and which would be dismantled for scrap. The immediate post-war period placed enormous strain on the Navy's infrastructure. Submarine bases from the East Coast to the West Coast were overwhelmed with returning vessels. Each boat required demobilization, preservation measures, and security. The Bureau of Ships struggled to care for hundreds of complex war machines just as Congress cut budgets and pushed for rapid military downsizing. At Mare Island alone, more than 40 submarines were packed tightly together. Their batteries were disconnected, fuel tanks drained, and internal compartments left open to reduce corrosion. Similar conditions existed at Pearl Harbor, where submarines returned from forward bases like Guam and Midway, and at Philadelphia, where Atlantic-based boats gathered in large numbers. Not all submarines were in the same shape. Some had finished combat patrols only weeks earlier and remained in excellent condition. Others showed the scars of years at sea, with worn hulls and outdated equipment made obsolete by rapid wartime advancements. To manage this uncertainty, the Navy placed many submarines into a preservation status known as Red Lead Row, keeping them in basic working condition while delaying final decisions. Unlike other surplus war assets, such as merchant ships or escort carriers that were quickly sold or scrapped, submarines received special attention. Navy leadership understood that future wars might once again depend on underwater power, even if no one yet knew what form those conflicts would take. In 1945, the Navy still did not have a clear long-term plan, so it divided its fleet submarines into several broad categories. Some boats remained active, forming the core of the peacetime Navy. Others were placed into reserve, kept in a condition that allowed them to be reactivated if needed. A separate group was assigned to training schools and experimental programs, while the remaining submarines were labeled surplus and marked for eventual disposal. This system was not fixed and continued to evolve as Cold War realities slowly took shape. At first, roughly 70 fleet submarines stayed in full active service. Given the sharp cuts in military spending, this was a surprisingly large number, though still small compared to wartime strength. These submarines received priority treatment, including the newest equipment, the most experienced crews, and early access to upgrades and modifications. Around 100 additional submarines entered the Reserve fleet. Most were concentrated at bases such as May Island, New London, and Philadelphia. Preservation teams coated the hulls with protective materials, sealed openings, and installed dehumidification systems to slow corrosion. The goal was to keep these boats in a condition where they could be restored if future needs demanded it. At the same time, post-war testing and experimentation absorbed many submarines that might otherwise have been scrapped. During the war, innovation had often taken a backseat to mass production. After 1945, that restraint vanished. The submarine force began studying how to achieve higher underwater speeds, testing new propulsion ideas, improving sonar and fire control systems, and experimenting with radically different hull shapes. Captured German Type XXI submarines offered valuable insight and inspiration, but American-built boats became the main platform for this research. USS Tench was converted into a research vessel for the David Taylor Model Basin, where it supported experiments on hull coatings, control surfaces, and pressure hull changes. In 1948, USS Durante underwent dramatic streamlining. External fittings were removed or reshaped, and the deck structure was altered, turning her into the fastest conventionally powered submarine of the time. These upgrades became part of the Guppy program, short for Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program, which transformed submarine design by focusing on underwater performance rather than surface speed. Between 1946 and 1951, 52 Fleet submarines received Guppy conversions of varying levels. They gained smoother hulls, larger battery capacity, snorkel systems, and modern sensors. Instead of being mothballed, these submarines were effectively preserved through modernization. Weapons testing claimed additional submarines, sometimes with destructive results. Operation Crossroads, the atomic bomb test at Bikini Atoll in July 1946, included 2 Fleet submarines among the target ships. USS Den Tudor and USS Skipjack were anchored alongside battleships, cruisers, and destroyers when the nuclear devices detonated. Skipjack survived both the air and underwater blasts, providing critical data on how submarines responded to nuclear shock waves before eventually sinking. Den Tudor suffered less physical damage but became too radioactive to recover. These tests confirmed a key concern. While submarines could avoid some blast effects by diving, they remained vulnerable to powerful shock waves traveling through water. Other submarines were used as torpedo and mine test targets. USS Cusk and USS Carabiniero were modified to launch early guided missiles, laying the groundwork for submarine-launched cruise weapons that would later become central to modern naval strategy. The Navy's readiness to modify, experiment with, and even destroy its fleet submarines showed confidence in their fundamental design. More importantly, it reflected an understanding that preparing for the future of submarine warfare mattered far more than saving every hull built during the war. Between 1945 and 1952, the United States also used several assistance programs to share its submarine experience with close allies. The Royal Navy, badly weakened by wartime losses and struggling under severe economic pressure, urgently needed modern submarines while its own shipbuilding capacity slowly recovered. As a result, a number of American fleet submarines were transferred to British service. HMS Scotsman, formerly USS Stingray, along with 13 sister boats, helped fill this gap during the early years of the Cold War. These submarines were refitted with British equipment and modifications and were mainly used for crew training and experimental work, though they also provided real operational capability. Some British submariners valued the American boats for their reliability and generous internal space, while others felt they were large and less agile compared to traditional British designs. Despite mixed opinions, the transfers strengthened cooperation between the United States and Britain. They also gave British engineers first-hand experience with American submarine construction and systems, contributing valuable technical insight. By the mid-1950s, most of these submarines were returned to U.S. control after completing their roles, although a few remained in service longer as training vessels. Interest from the Soviet Union followed a very different path. The USSR received no American submarines and instead focused on studying captured German documents and, on rare occasions, observing U.S. boats during brief joint activities in 1945. Throughout the late 1940s, Soviet intelligence closely monitored American submarine developments, fully aware of the threat posed by modern submarines operating from Western bases. Rather than copying American designs directly, the Soviet submarine program emphasized large numbers and rapid production over individual technological refinement. American awareness of this growing Soviet fleet influenced decisions about which submarines to keep, which to modernize, and which to discard. In the Cold War environment, Submarine disposal became more than a budget issue. It was a strategic choice tied to maintaining technological superiority. The actual scrapping process began in 1946 and accelerated through the early 1950s. Congress pushed the Navy to cut costs and eliminate excess capacity. Older S-class submarines from the 1920s were the first to go, as their outdated designs and worn hulls offered little value in modern naval warfare. Between 1946 and 1948, 31 S-class boats were dismantled at facilities in Philadelphia, Mare Island, and Puget Sound. Commercial crews cut through pressure hulls, removed machinery, and reduced entire submarines to raw scrap. Fleet submarines soon followed as financial pressure increased. The Navy developed clear criteria for disposal: boats with structural damage, designs unsuited for modernization, or maintenance costs that outweighed their usefulness. USS Perch, damaged by an onboard explosion during the war, was ordered scrapped in 1948. USS Grenadier, scuttled and later raised, proved too expensive to repair and was broken up in 1946. By 1950, 4-2 Fleet submarines had been scrapped. Their steel was recycled, equipment salvaged, and their service reduced to photographs, logs, and patrol reports. The exact methods varied, but most submarines were partially defueled and cleaned at naval yards before being handed over to commercial breakers. Some boats served briefly as pier-side training hulks, their interiors used for instruction even as their external systems slowly deteriorated. These stationary trainers continued to provide value long after their days at sea had ended. Over time, many training and reserve submarines were simply lost to corrosion and neglect. In some cases, the Navy chose a more deliberate end by using surplus submarines as target vessels for weapons testing. This approach not only removed unwanted hulls, but also produced valuable technical data. In 1948, USS Turner was used for live torpedo trials, absorbing multiple hits before finally sinking. These tests helped validate new torpedo designs while efficiently disposing of submarines no longer worth maintaining. The speed of disposal closely followed budget cycles and political pressure. Congressional committees demanded visible reductions in naval strength, arguing that large submarine numbers were excessive in a world without major surface threats. The Navy complied, though it worked hard to protect a modern core force and a viable reserve. Economic realities reinforced these choices. Keeping submarines in reserve was cheaper than active service, but it still required inspections, security, and periodic maintenance. Every preserved boat carried an opportunity cost, tying up funds that could otherwise support new construction or frontline operations. Navy planners concluded that upgrading older submarines through guppy conversions was far more economical than building new boats, while still delivering roughly 80% of the capability. This calculation saved many submarines from scrapping. Boats in poor condition or with designs unsuited to modernization were not so fortunate. Overall, the disposal programs were remarkably efficient. Between 1946 and 1955, the Navy reduced its submarine inventory from more than 200 boats to fewer than 100 active and reserve units. This downsizing occurred even as surviving submarines were modernized and the foundations of nuclear propulsion were being laid. Foreign military assistance programs absorbed additional submarines during the 1950s and 1960s. Brazil received USS Muskellonge and USS Paddle in 1957, operating them as Humata and Riachuelo into the early 1970s. Turkey took possession of USS Mero and USS Threadfin in 1948 and kept them in service into the 1960s while building its own submarine force. Argentina, Chile, Greece, Italy, and Peru also received American fleet submarines through similar arrangements. These transfers supported Cold War containment by strengthening Allied navies while allowing the United States to retire boats it no longer needed. In many cases, recipient nations operated these submarines for decades, extending their service lives far beyond what would have been possible under U.S. ownership. Brazilian crews, for example, kept Humata operational until 1968, 23 years after her original commissioning, highlighting the durability of American wartime submarine design. Preservation efforts remained limited in the decades immediately after the war. The Navy had no formal plan to save submarines as historical artifacts, viewing them primarily as tools rather than museum pieces. USS Bowfin became one of the first preserved submarines in the United States when she opened to the public at Pearl Harbor in 1981. Her survival was driven largely by civilian initiative, though the Navy later offered support. Other submarines followed. USS Cod, moored in Cleveland since 1959, serves as a memorial and museum maintained by volunteers. USS Lionfish rests in Fall River, Massachusetts, while USS Becuna in Philadelphia and USS Pampanito in San Francisco preserve similar legacies. Together, these boats represent only a small fraction of the hundreds built during the war. Each preserved submarine required extensive restoration to make it safe and accessible while remaining historically accurate. Preserving submarines is far more challenging than maintaining surface ships, as their pressure hulls, confined spaces, and internal systems demand constant care. Preserving submarines presents unique challenges. Their steel hulls require constant protection from corrosion, both inside and out. Battery compartments pose environmental risks, while the tight internal layout severely limits visitor access. As a result, most museum submarines only open selected areas to the public, typically the forward torpedo room, control room, and aft torpedo room. Engineering spaces and crew living quarters are often sealed off or heavily modified for safety reasons. Occasionally, new discoveries add to our understanding of what survives. Archaeological surveys have located several lost American submarines whose wartime fates were long known, but whose exact resting places had vanished from records. These wrecks lie in Pacific waters off American coastlines and are now protected war graves and historic sites. While they remain inaccessible to the public, they hold deep historical and emotional significance. Today, roughly 20 American fleet submarines survive in relatively complete form worldwide. This represents less than 10% of those built during the war, a survival rate similar to other wartime vessels, yet still a major loss of physical history. The submarines preserved as museums offer rare insight into daily life aboard these boats, the technology that enabled victory in the Pacific, and the human cost of underwater warfare. Museum operators face constant difficulties maintaining aging steel structures exposed to salt, air, and harsh weather. Restoration requires specialized skills, increasingly rare original equipment, and significant financial support. Despite these obstacles, the educational value of preserved submarines remains immense. The influence of American wartime submarines extended far beyond their years of active service. The Guppy modernization program proved that improved streamlining and expanded battery capacity could dramatically enhance underwater performance. These principles shaped conventional submarine design well into the 1970s. Operating hundreds of submarines across vast Pacific distances also shaped American strategic thinking. Range, endurance, and crew habitability became essential requirements for Cold War submarines, influencing both conventional and nuclear designs. Soviet submarine development reflected many of these ideas, absorbed through intelligence efforts and through examination of German submarines that had themselves been influenced by American capabilities. The transition from World War II fleet submarines to nuclear-powered boats such as USS Nautilus was an evolution rather than a sudden break. Nuclear propulsion built upon decades of American submarine experience, adding unmatched endurance and power to proven concepts. Cold War tensions ensured that many wartime submarines remained available well into the 1960s. Around 50 fleet submarines were held in reserve storage until improved Soviet capabilities, and the rapid expansion of U.S. nuclear submarines rendered conventional boats unsuitable for frontline service. The last active American fleet submarine, USS Teru, was decommissioned in 1975, 30 years after entering service, having spent her final years primarily in training roles. This longevity underscored the strength of wartime construction and the soundness of the original designs. During the 1970s, the Navy accelerated the disposal of reserve submarines, acknowledging that reactivation was no longer realistic and long-term preservation too costly. Between 1969 and 1976, more than 40 fleet submarines left reserve status and were quietly dismantled at commercial shipbreaking yards. Among the final boat scrap were some of the newer Tench-class submarines, vessels that had seen limited combat but were ultimately overtaken by rapid technological change. Their conventional diesel-electric propulsion ultimately made them unsuitable for a Navy that was rapidly shifting toward nuclear power. Yet the story of America's wartime submarine fleet is not only technical, it also carries deep moral and historical weight. Historians and museum professionals continue to examine the consequences of the U.S. submarine campaign in the Pacific. There is no doubt that American submarines played a decisive role in victory by cutting Japan's merchant shipping and crippling its war economy. At the same time, the loss of life among Japanese sailors and civilians aboard torpedoed vessels raises ethical questions that remain relevant decades later. Museum submarines approach this history with varying levels of openness, seeking to honor American veterans while also acknowledging the broader human cost of war. These preserved boats stand as physical links to a period when American submarine crews conducted the most effective submarine campaign in naval history, sinking more than 1,300 Japanese ships. That success, however, came at a heavy price. The U.S. submarine force suffered the highest casualty rate of any American service branch, losing 52 submarines and more than 3,500 sailors. Today's museum submarines serve both as memorials to that sacrifice and as educational tools that explain the technical and human realities of underwater warfare. The speed at which this powerful fleet disappeared is striking. Within 10 years of victory, more than half of the submarines had been scrapped. Within 20 years, only a small number remained in any form of service. This transformation was driven by necessity. Maintaining hundreds of diesel submarines made little strategic or economic sense in the nuclear age. Yet the thoroughness of disposal had lasting consequences. Each scrapped submarine carried away unique details, specific modifications, combat wear, and operational history that were never fully recorded. As a result, only about 20 of the original 203 fleet submarines survive today. While invaluable, these few museum examples cannot fully represent the wide variations within the class. Researchers must rely heavily on documents, photographs, and survivor accounts, knowing that most of the physical evidence vanished without detailed study. Pearl Harbor itself reflects this rapid transformation. In 1945, it was crowded with victorious gray submarines, symbols of American industrial power and engineering skill. Within a generation, those boats were gone, replaced by sleek nuclear submarines. The once modern diesel fleet quickly appeared outdated. Loud engines, surface-oriented designs, and limited endurance no longer suited to Cold War realities. Unlike post-war Europe, the Pacific offered little enemy technology to exploit. Japan's submarine force had been devastated and never achieved the strategic impact of German U-boats. Instead, it was American submarine technology that others sought to understand, counter, or imitate. The Soviet Union closely studied U.S. capabilities while building its own opposing force. Allied nations looked to American submarines to modernize their fleets and learn from U.S. operational experience. Disposing of submarines posed challenges far beyond those of surface ships. Each boat contained large lead-acid batteries requiring careful handling, along with fuel, lubricants, and thick-pressure hulls resistant to cutting. Shipbreakers developed specialized methods, often slicing submarines into sections for easier processing. The scrap yielded large quantities of steel, non-ferrous metals, and reusable equipment, helping offset costs. Some components found new life aboard other submarines or in training facilities. Once scrapping began, a submarine could disappear in a matter of weeks. Hulls were cut apart, machinery removed, and the vessel's identity reduced to paperwork and memory. This efficiency, practical and necessary, meant that preservation only happened when people made a conscious choice to save history. Without those efforts, the most successful class of submarines ever built might have vanished entirely. If you found this story compelling, watch what happened to Germany's revolutionary Type XXI U-boats after World War II. Their influence on American and Soviet submarine design was immense, yet nearly all were scrapped or destroyed within a decade. Like this video, subscribe and turn on notifications for more deep dives into military history. Thanks for watching.